Welcome to Negotiation Made Simple, where we help you master the art of negotiation and win the next deal. I'm your host, John Lowry. In this episode, we are going to focus on high-stakes negotiation. And here with me to have that conversation is John Pion. John is the founding shareholder of Pion, Nerone, Gurman, and Smith, a major law firm based out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. John is a litigator. He represents clients who are involved in very significant catastrophic events. And John has been a litigator for well over 30 years, has tried numerous cases. But one of the things that John has also developed is he has developed a practice as resolution counsel, where John gets brought in not to necessarily advocate, but he gets brought in to try to figure out how to work with parties to get a case settled. And as a result of that, John spends his time working with the actual injured parties, working with their attorneys, and engaging in a different conversation and a different process to try to work toward resolution. As a result of this, John leads these high-stakes negotiations with these lawyers and with these injured parties. And he works to try to bring resolution in an environment that can be very difficult in terms of fostering a positive and productive outcome for all of the parties involved. In this episode, I'm excited about this conversation with John because he's going to share with us some ideas that all of us can benefit from when we find ourselves in a high-stakes negotiation. He will give us some practical advice for how we can manage that negotiation most effectively to bring about great outcomes when it matters most. Let's jump into this conversation with John Pion. John, you and I have a lot in common, as we've learned from some of our preliminary conversations here.
We do indeed. I think we get dropped into some messy situations, and we're tasked with the responsibility of trying to find closure. And you meet lots of interesting people, and certainly bringing those kinds of cases to resolution is very, very meaningful.
Absolutely. Well, let's set it up for folks a little bit. Talk about how typically you get involved and the kinds of cases that you get involved in that put you in the middle of having to manage kind of these high stakes negotiations.
So my practice is sort of split into two categories. One, I'm still an active litigator, and in that role, I help maybe a dozen clients manage their litigation and their events all over the country. And in those cases, I'm involved, very early, sometimes within minutes or hours of the event occurring. The events that I'm involved in are typically catastrophic. They involve serious injuries or deaths, or in the saddest of cases, multiple deaths. And the task there is to find a path towards resolution as quickly as we can, and we can get into the reasons why that's so important. The other part of my practice is that as settlement counsel. And many times I get pulled into those cases very late. I get pulled into those cases where pleadings have been filed and depositions have been taken. And most importantly, from the negotiation standpoints, people have taken up positions. Sometimes the positions are quite polarized, and it's my job to try to break down some of that anger, resentment, whatever it may be, eliminate some of that and get people talking.
And so tell people a little bit, why would someone, if they already have lawyers involved who are preparing the case for trial and working with opposing counsel, they may even have mediated the case once or twice to try to resolve it. Why is it that they bring in settlement counsel? What's the unique skill set that's brought to the table here?
So it's a second set of eyes. It's a second set of a reality check. And many times I come in and my views are consistent with trial counsel in terms of liability or exposure. But as settlement counsel, I can bring I don't want to say that someone's being untruthful, but I can bring truthfulness to the negotiations. I can acknowledge the injuries. I can acknowledge the sympathies that are likely to be drawn from the other side because I'm not litigating the case. And so I can put my own personal opinions into the mix without jeopardizing the pleadings or the legal positions that are being taken because I'm just a person who's been asked to get both parties to start talking again. And it puts me in a position where there, as you know, and what we do, there are no rules. There's no procedure. There is no protocol. There's no checklist. You get dropped into a mess and you're asked to, the question is, move this thing along. And it's really up to our imagination on how best we can bridge some of the gaps between both sides, where we can find commonality between both sides. And again, some of it is simply acknowledging how bad this event was and how traumatic it was for the family or for the victim himself, or in many cases, both.
I think that's really well said. I mean, one of the ways that I like to say it is sometimes you have to separate the advocacy from the resolution. But you need someone on your side to do that. It's not something just a mediator can do. And that different perspective and thinking about a different approach to try to get it resolved, it's not that the lawyers are doing anything wrong. It's just they're doing their job. They're there to be the advocate. They're there to position the case as strongly as they possibly can. And in doing so, it's really difficult, at least for the lawyers that I've talked to then turn that off and become very conciliatory and become very collaborative in terms of an approach to kind of get it done. And so that's where, at least for my clients, they see the value is we want our advocate to be our advocate, but we need someone from our perspective who's thinking very strategically in terms of what is the best approach to kind of get this done. So you mentioned, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say the other thing that I find in this role as settlement counsel is I have resources that a trial lawyer cannot have. I can make offers to assist the family, either financially or with arrangements that their own lawyers can't do because they're prohibited by the rules of ethics to individually fund a set of circumstances that exist. And I can give you an example. We're involved in a really awful situation where there was an elderly gentleman who was significantly injured, very seriously injured, closed head injuries and orthopedic injuries. But when he came to and was able to communicate, his greatest fear was his wife, who was suffering from dementia. And he was her primary caregiver. Mm-hmm. While he was in a coma and unconscious, his family stepped in to bridge that gap. But there's only so many weeks of time off that they could do and so many weeks of vacation they can burn. I'm a resource. We stepped in immediately and said, we're going to let you screen and interview 3 nurses that we will put in your home. And that'll free up the family to return to their families and their jobs. Sure. And give this husband an opportunity to heal, knowing that his wife is in excellent care and excellent hands. That's a resource that his lawyer, that family lawyer, cannot offer him, but we can. And we did that in the guise of being settlement counsel, and we're taking a damage off the blackboard because that is a blackboardable item of damage that family could have presented. But more importantly, we're creating a solution to an immediate problem they have. And 9 times out of 10, people remember that when we get to the final negotiation process, and they remembered that you were fair and that you were kind and that you showed empathy. And that comes back. And if they don't acknowledge it at the end of the day, it's okay, because at the end, you have to look yourself in the mirror. And if you're being kind, and if you're being empathetic, and if you're treating them the way that you would want someone to treat your family, and it doesn't earn you credit, that's okay too. You still did the right thing.
Yeah, those are some just fundamental human things that is a big part of what I think are important to what I think is important to negotiation. And right there, you're providing some nursing care for the wife, but what you're really doing is you're relieving a burden that he has, and that goes a long way in terms of trying to work with this husband as he fulfills what is kind of a sacred responsibility in terms of caring for his wife. This is a high stakes moment. Every single one of your cases are a high stakes moment. What I want to do for a second is just step back and have you break down for people. If we use like a medical example, for instance, and said, okay, if we were to describe the anatomy of a high stakes negotiation, like what are some of the elements that just always seem to be present?
So personalities,
okay,
and I'm going to have personalities both on both sides of the V, so to speak, both defense counsel and plaintiff's counsel. They're going to have their own discrete personalities. There may be history between those two lawyers that requires some massaging. There may be some history between the parties that requires some intel. There may be emotions that are both appropriate and perhaps a bit overplayed that you have to deal with. And there may be anger and there may be downright hatred. I've gone into situations where the anger and the hostility was so great that guns were displayed.
Wow.
And in one particular instance, I asked the gentleman who was an in-law of the deceased and an in-law of another person who was critically injured, if his intention was to scare me to the point where I wanted to run, and maybe I used a slightly different description in that, and he said it was. And I said, well, you've accomplished your mission. You have terrified me. And I would really like it if you could put that weapon aside and maybe for us to continue this conversation, maybe your father-in-law will ask you to do the same. And the father-in-law told him it was time to put his 9mm Glock away. And so a couple things happened there. Number one, father-in-law and I found a little bit of commonality on maybe the son-in-law bringing the gun into the dining room was a bad idea. And we were actually able to joke once we had things under control over just how terrified he made a visiting lawyer when he put that on the table, and we moved on. And I'm pleased to say that we eventually got that case resolved without litigation. And I did not have to stop on the way home and order myself any new garments. So I'll leave it at that. But those are so when you talk about breaking down the anatomy, it's looking at those types of human things from an objective standpoint. It's trying to decipher why are we still at odds in a case where there is 100% absolute liability. And if it's a legal question, what can I do to get people past it'll never be admissible to we're going to win this argument? And so it's very helpful for me to find out, why are we butting heads and what's going on that's causing that? And if I can, what can I do to fix it? So I think that's in a very 40,000 foot sort of the anatomy of the claim of what I try to do. Okay.
So we've got a substantive problem in terms of the incident that's happened and the legal dispute that has arisen as a result of it. And so that's kind of the substantive piece. But then we got this whole human element that you've just described. And one of the challenges is like business people, many times when they're negotiating with people representing other businesses, there are some expectations, there's some decorum, there's some baseline skills that you can kind of expect around the negotiation. However, in your context, which is interesting, is you have people that you're negotiating with where you can't assume that there is that baseline understanding of how this is going to go, how people are going to behave, the skill set that people bring to the table. But that's actually something that negotiators and business people and organizational leaders have to deal with all the time. And I think about employees, to where, employees, when things get emotional around their work, they all of a sudden begin to act out in ways that, like the gentleman that you had to deal with, they're very intense, but they're not productive in terms of the kind of things that they do from a self-help standpoint to try to influence the process. And so it was amazing how you held your decorum there. You did a lot better job than I would have done in terms of being able to move that process forward despite that threat that existed in the room. But how is it that you find yourself negotiating with many times people that are in this heightened emotional state, don't have the skill set, don't have the background, don't have the experience? They have a lawyer that does, but what I find so often is the lawyers haven't prepped them, or the lawyers haven't done the hard work of working with their emotions so that they're at a place to be productive. How do you connect with those people? Because I think that's a really valuable lesson for folks who find themselves in similar situations.
So I insist on meeting people and sitting across the table from people.
Wow.
And I'm not a fan, at least in the earliest part of this process, of Zoom calls or Zoom visits because it's too distant. And so I like to sit across the table from people, and it's not unusual in these situations where I explain my thought process to plaintiff's counsel, and they give me access to their clients. 9 times out of 10, I'm sitting in their office, meeting with the client, and I tell the plaintiff's lawyer, look, you're calling the balls and strikes. If you don't like a question, if you don't like the tone, if you don't like the color sports coat I wore, send me home, because you absolutely control this entire dialogue. You're giving me the privilege of visiting with your client. It's that communication and it's the listening to them that I think takes some of the emotion out. And I think that's probably a transferable skill. We go into negotiations very, very polarized. But if you listen to what the other side has to say, and particularly in cases where I'm not the lead litigator, where I'm just there to settle, it's okay to sympathize. It's okay to say, I understand how awful it is to be in an MRI machine every 30 days. I hate those devices. It's okay to share those types of things because you're recognizing their problems, you're recognizing their fears, you're recognizing all that. And that's part of being truthful and open and honest. Most importantly, listening to them and appreciating how they've been impacted by whatever this event was.
And so once you gain that understanding, once you've had that moment where you've listened to them and they've shared, how then do you transition that into coming up with different ideas that might resolve the case? And how do you do it in such a way that you stay true to what your objectives or your client's objectives are in whatever the resolution might be?
So every negotiation, every case has a value. And our job as settlement counsel is to direct that case into that range of value that everyone will find satisfactory. Sometimes I go into these with a value that I have to modify because I come out of these meetings saying, we didn't value this case properly. This person is going to make an impression that is much better than how that may be reflected on paper or in a deposition. This person, has great meaning and great presence, and so we have to adjust the values. But if you go into those with a realistic range and you're honest about that realistic range, again, more times than not, you can find peace. But you need to find out what's the sticking point between point one and point two. And sometimes there are legal arguments that need to be hashed out. And one strategy I use is many times I'll have both sides tell me who their preferred mediator is. More times than not, that person is a former judge. Once I know that they both have great respect for that judge, I will then hire that judge and ask that judge to do an advisory opinion on the critical legal issue. I have no idea where that judge is going to fall, whether it's going to be favorable to the defense or favorable to the plaintiff. But once I have that advisory opinion, I publish it to both sides. Now we have something to talk about. Now, plaintiffs, your position has been significantly weakened because a judge that you really respect does not believe that the law in a certain state is going to apply. It's going to be a different set of laws which reduce that exposure for the defense, or vice versa. I just want to know way ahead of the time, way ahead of the jury, way ahead of jury selection and trial and all those expenses, where that is more than likely to fall. And once I have that information, I can talk to both sides. If they don't like my advisory opinion, they can disregard it. They don't have to consider it. But again, more times than not, you get that dialogue, you get that conversation moving, you eliminate those two polarized positions, and you get people moving to the middle. You have a shot at getting this resolved.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting approach. And I think for a lot of folks, that is, our friends from Harvard and getting to yes, they would call that objective criteria. And sometimes you've got to go get objective criteria. In the legal world, it would be a judicial opinion from a former judge like you just described. And that objective criteria can become sort of an anchor for both sides in terms of trying to get to a reasonable zone around that objective criteria. The question I have for you that I'm just curious about, and then I want to talk more about that, is when that advisory opinion does not come back in your client's favor. And so instead of strengthening your case, you've perhaps weakened it. How do you handle that moment?
I tell them. I tell them that somebody that our lawyers have tremendous respect for believe that the legal ruling is going to be unfavorable 9 months, 15 months, 2 years down the road.
Yeah.
And that we ought to factor that into the evaluation. And maybe our evaluation has to go up in order to accommodate what this advisory opinion is. And again, when I go into these roles of settlement counsel, I try to go in being very open-minded as to where this case is going to land. I don't go in with a fixed number, and I don't necessarily go in with a playbook that I have to drive this case to a certain number. I want to sort of find out, where that middle ground can be and press for that middle ground. Commonality is how I would describe it, John.
Okay, got it. And so that objective criteria, that is an important part of the preparation process for folks, is as they approach a negotiation to have some sense of where that deal should play out. And many times when people don't do that, when they just take this kind of let's see what happens approach, that's where expectations can vary so dramatically that you find yourself in a place to where it is difficult to get a deal done because people's expectations were so high or so low that they'll never be able to achieve those. And it can take time and in moments be very difficult for people to recalibrate those expectations into a place that's more reasonable. And so what do you do with folks whose expectations are just completely out of line, but it's not the lawyers and the judicial opinion to where you can kind of bring them in. It's people that aren't looking at the problem from a rational standpoint. They've, for whatever reason, their mind has landed on a number or landed on a solution, and they are just unwilling to be shaken off of it easily.
So that's probably the most difficult because in that instance, sometimes I'm working with the plaintiff lawyer to try to pull his or her client into the realm of reasonable.
Sure.
Sometimes that's conversation. Sometimes that's sharing data, whether it's settlement or verdict research. And sometimes it's just talking about the obvious, time and money, and you could have this today, and we can use a structured settlement, and this could take care of your family, and we can move some money in to certain pockets for your children, and those are advantages that you will not get if you proceed to trial. So sometimes it's just having those kinds of conversations. But, at the end of the day, you and I don't have magic wands, and we can't make irrational people do rational things, but you can sure try. And again, I think talking and listening are two components that in this age, I don't want to say are forgotten over text messaging and emails, but talking and listening are really, really important to try to find out, just what we can do to move things to conclusion.
Yeah, and one of the things you highlighted right there, I think, is something that is important for people to recognize in negotiation. You see it play out politically a lot, but in the process of negotiation, you have enemies that become allies and allies that can become enemies through this process. And so you have these moments where your adversary might actually become your ally that you're working with to get someone else to do something. And it's true in the other case as well, to where you could have a co-defendant that actually becomes a bigger challenge than the plaintiff in terms of how they're looking at a case or how they're positioning. And as a result of that, what you just said is really important, that communication and that listening is critical, because the assumptions that you make about who will be helpful and who won't be helpful, at least I've learned, those assumptions can be very wrong at times and can change over the course of a single negotiation.
Yeah, I would agree 100%.
So as you think about some of the very practical skills that have helped you develop this kind of national reputation that you enjoy as a settlement counsel, get real practical for us. What are some of the very practical skills that you have developed that causes you to be successful in this area of negotiation?
So, pick up the phone.
Okay.
Number one, be willing to demonstrate to the other side your sincerity in trying to move the case. And I can give you an example of that. A horrific event that resulted in the death of a young woman, leaving behind her child. Child was injured as well. I don't think the lawyer was taking me seriously, nor did I believe the family thought we were sincere, because they scheduled our first face-to-face meeting at 8 a.m. the Monday after Easter Sunday, knowing that I would have to travel across the country in order to accommodate the one day that they gave me.
Yeah.
And so my wife for 42 years is well acquainted with those types of sacrifices, understood we'd have to move the family dinner to Saturday instead of Sunday. And so I was in that office at 8 a.m. the Monday after Easter. And I understood that I passed the first test, and that was, yes, was I committed to this process? yes, was I willing to demonstrate my sincerity? And yes, to the extent that it constituted a sacrifice, was I willing to make a sacrifice? That meeting that was scheduled for about 30 minutes lasted nearly 2 hours.
Wow.
And we talked to the family and the extended family, and passing that test allowed us to find resolution shortly after that, because they understood that we were sincere in our efforts and our interest to mitigate their pain and the trauma that they'd already gone through. And we wanted them to avoid litigation, because that would just be a second set of trauma that no one needed to bear. So,
yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like that was a test, and the test was not, anything legal related. The test was, do you care?
right.
And do you care enough to sacrifice a holiday with your family to come and try to be responsive to what kind of my needs are? And, those kinds of tests, I think it's admirable of your willingness to do it. It's also annoying at times, but we see that often in our world in terms of those kinds of moments and just having to kind of step up in those moments.
Well, when we talk about negotiations in a broader sense, parties are always testing and baiting one another.
Sure.
And you have to pick your fights.
Yep.
And that was a concession that cost us nothing financially. And so, but it was going to give us a huge edge on the, can you trust them? Are they sincere?
Yeah.
And so in the final analysis, it was a pretty easy decision to make. And it was, again, incredibly productive. So, I think about how many times, somebody insists on a certain location or a certain time, or these people have to be present, and you're really knocking heads over details that at the end of the day are not really consequential. And so if you make those concessions, to whether it's to satisfy ego or anger or something that really has nothing to do with the core value, you're not really giving up a whole lot.
Yeah.
So you sort of turn the other cheek, move on, and I think more times than not, it works out favorably for you.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said about picking up the phone or getting together in person with people. It's one of those things where it's not comfortable. People always tend to gravitate towards what's comfortable, and especially in the moment of conflict, that is not comfortable to sit across from the people that you find yourself in conflict with. But the value of that, I just can't. I can't overvalue that. I mean, it's just so incredibly important for people to really get a sense and a feel for where people are at. That just doesn't translate as well over Zoom, or doesn't translate as well through an attorney describing it for you. And sitting there and having those moments, they do create a connection. And so, for negotiators everywhere, the more that you can get together in person, especially in a world that has, in the spirit of convenience, has eliminated a lot of that, I think it is really, really important to keep that a part of a really professional negotiator's toolkit.
Yeah, no doubt. You reminded me of a situation not long ago where I visited a young man who had suffered a C2 complete dissection, so he was paralyzed from the chin down. And I stood in the rehab facility, and I said to him, I kind of rehearsed on what I would say to you when we first met. And I was going to say something like, "How are you doing?" And now I realize what a terrible introduction that is. And I'm going to ask you, how would you like me to start our conversation? Because I have nothing to say to you. I can't say anything that's going to brighten this situation. What he eventually told me is that as much as he liked that facility, there was another one that he thought was going to give him his best chances. And as slim as those chances were, he wanted to be at that other facility. I'll go back to the resource situation. We were able to make some connections and get him into that other facility. Not sure if it made any difference or not, but it meant something to him. And for a 20-something, knowing what he was facing in life, I was happy to be able to be that kind of a resource. It's the emphasis. If I'm not there, if we're on Zoom, we're never having that conversation. We're never having that moment. It's just not going to occur. And so if there's one takeaway from this, and that is get on a plane, fly to New Mexico, get on a plane, fly to wherever I flew for this visit, but take that additional step, take that initiative. It pays back in spades.
Very good. So last thing I want to cover is I really want to get your thoughts and advice for anyone that is preparing for a high stakes negotiation like we've been talking about here today. What would you counsel them in terms of a preparation process to get ready for that deal? And let's assume that the substantive preparation is going to happen. What advice do you have in terms of how they prepare to manage the process?
Stay calm. Don't let your emotions impact judgment. Go back to seeing a gun come out. Don't let fear consume me and terminate the visit. But stay in control of your emotions. Listen, and try to find that commonality, even on the smallest things. The smallest things that you can bridge are going to form the foundation for maybe bridging the bigger problem. So those would be some 40,000-foot suggestions.
Good deal. Well, John, I really appreciate your time and your insight, the thoughts that you've shared with respect to having people kind of get together and the value of kind of the old school face-to-face meeting and the importance that plays in really high stakes negotiations, I think is something that all of us can take as a really good lesson as we find ourselves in these moments where the consequences are significant and the stakes are high, and we've got to put ourselves in the best place in order to get a great deal. And so your counsel will be helpful to us as we manage those sometimes difficult but very important moments in our businesses and in our lives. So thanks for your time this morning.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
This episode reinforces a common theme that we hear in many episodes of the Negotiation Made Simple podcast, and that is that you cannot divorce the human element from negotiation. I love how John talked about in high stakes negotiation, even though it's uncomfortable, even though it's difficult, it is so important to get with the people that you find yourself in conflict with, or get with the people that you're trying to do business with. The importance of being together, of being able to look into each other's eyes, being able to have real conversation in the same room together. There is just nothing that can replace that experience and the information that comes from that experience. It's also a way to bring about much stronger connection than what can be achieved via telephone or via Zoom. And so John's reminder and the importance of developing a skill set to where you're comfortable in that environment, working one-on-one, in person with people, is critical to our success as a negotiator. Thanks for listening to the Negotiation Made Simple podcast, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.